making. So looking ahead at our outline, we have a few agenda items we're going to talk about. I'll start off by talking about the group projects, just really quick about that. Then we'll go into a brief review of what we talked about last time. And then we'll move into kind of the main part of today, which is judgment, decision making. And then I'll tell you what you can expect for next time. So that's what's on the agenda. So housekeeping items. We'll be starting with... Actually, let's not start with the semester project. Just really quickly, if you haven't read the syllabus, I'm going to say again, read the updated syllabus addendum. You should make sure you have a general idea of what's changed. I don't expect you to know everything because it's overwhelming. There's a lot I put in there. Definitely a few chunks of things have changed. So just try to get a general idea of what you need to do. Rely on your groups, rely on each other. And if you forget anything, if anything is unclear, talk to me. So I won't go through everything about the syllabus. I'll just focus on the semester project. So heads up, we're still doing this thing. You guys are still going to work on the semester project together. And mostly everything will be the same. You are still going to be in your same groups. You're still working with the same people, and you still have the same facilitators. If you are a facilitator, I would say your responsibilities are still roughly the same. Check in with your group. Make sure your group is doing well every once in a while, that you're all still on track. And if anything comes up, let me know. So let's talk about what's changed here. This was our previous outline. This is what we had planned. First thing that's changed are the group meetings. The group meetings are no longer happening. So because we can't meet in person anymore, we're not going to be doing that. Second thing that has changed is the infographic piece has been cut out. So those are gone. And all we have are the paper rough drafts and the final paper. So you'll have those two things that you need to do. The rough drafts are going to be due at the end of this week. Again, the information about that is on Canvas, as well as any of the details you need to know regarding what you need to submit. So basically, if your group gave me, or is about to give me, what you told me you were going to give me, and all the pieces are basically there, you got it. I'm going to be checking the notes that each facilitator has sent me to just double check that the criteria have been met. And if they have, then you get full points. You'll lose points, though, if you're missing pieces. That's basically the gist of it. The second piece is the final paper, and that'll be due in May. The new addition, in lieu of the group projects, what is going to happen is we're going to be doing these individual reports. So individual progress reports will happen twice. Once kind of the following week in April, so kind of mid-early April. And the second is happening kind of in May when your final paper are due. When your final papers are due. So these reports are replacing the... God, what is it replacing? The individual group meetings. So instead of checking in on you, getting your progress, and kind of grading you on your progress in those group meetings, I'm going to have you kind of write it up yourself. How these individual progress reports are going to be graded are in the syllabus again, so just check in on that. All right, so that's the gist of it with the project. If you have any questions, let me know. I look forward to hearing from you. Without further ado, let's get into review. So where we left off was literally this slide. The last slide we had together was me wishing you a happy spring break. And I hope you did. Welcome back from your spring break. I know it was probably hard, and it's still hard. But I hope you're taking time to take care of yourself. And really, welcome back. So aside from leaving off on that, we had talked about substance use and substance abuse, right? We talked about these 11 criteria that define substance use and substance abuse, and then we practiced applying some of these, right, in that coffee activity. And then we talked about takeaway messages and briefly, I think, discussed this about, now that we have thought about substance use and abuse, why do we think people use substances? To kind of give us a understanding, right? To build kind of an empathetic response, to understand what the feeling might be like. Now that you've kind of related it to coffee, and some of you are like, I feel personally called out here. But because you felt that, because you could see other people who might engage in a coffee addiction, right? Or abuse caffeine, that we were able to start thinking about why. Why do people abuse caffeine? And what are the contexts that lead to that? Again, drawing on our frameworks of maybe Bronfenbrenner's ecological model or things like that. So keep those in mind. They'll be helpful to you, both for this class and as you move forward to your professions. So with that review, without further ado, let us go into the topic for today, which is about judgment and decision-making, particularly among juveniles. And we'll say those that are younger than 18, but in particular those that might be even younger than that. Maybe just in their teens, between like maybe starting at 12-ish. But basically, youth, maybe kids, and their ability to make judgments, and how that ability to make judgments is affected by normative, developmental kind of stages. As in, kids, I guess the takeaway message I'm going to give you now is kids suck at making decisions, and part of it is just because that's how kids grow up. That's how their brains are set up, is that they're not very good at making decisions. So let's talk about why. But before we get into that, we're going to be going through one of your readings and talking through some of the main points that they brought up. So in order to set up our discussion here, we're going to talk about the idea of proportionality, and in particular, what you can think of proportionality as, specifically in legal terms, is it's this idea that the punishment should fit the crime, right? That there is a proportionality in the types of punishment you apply to people that break the law, so that there's a balance between whatever punishment or legal consequence someone has to how severe the crime is. If the crime is more severe, then you have more of a strict or restrictive type of punishment or consequence. And if the crime is less severe, if the transgression is less severe, then you have a lower punishment. Now, what the consideration, though, here is what is considered fair. What is considered a balance between these? What is a fair punishment in terms of the crime that you commit? And there are many things that help you balance this scale, help you determine whether your punishment is fair or not. But one thing people think about is this idea of blameworthiness. Basically, how culpable, how responsible were you for that crime, for the action that transgressed against the law? So blameworthiness here, you can think about it in terms of, let's say, a murder, or let's say you are an angry lion who decides that he wants to murder his brother and take over the pride of lions. What should happen to you should you do this? And how the law might decide what happens to that conniving lion might depend on the blameworthiness of that lion, or how culpable they were for their actions. Someone who, let's say, murders someone else can be considered less culpable or less blameworthy for that murder if there are various other types of stipulations For example, if the murder happened without premeditation, without any kind of planning or deliberation. Scar maybe didn't plan to kill Mufasa. It happened at the spur of the moment. Maybe if it happened as a spur of the moment type of thing, he would be less culpable for his actions. The law also views people as less culpable for killing someone if it was maybe under a certain type of duress, that they were emotionally charged, it was some kind of situation that involved a provocation, some kind of insult, something that made the person who did the killing very emotionally disturbed. Or if the resulting death was due to negligence, maybe, due to an accident or inaction, or something that wasn't necessarily purposeful, perhaps. So, overall, the takeaway message here is that there needs to be a fairness in punishment, and how something is determined to be fair or not may be part of the thing that goes into that, is whether they were blameworthy or culpable for their actions. So now that we've set the stage, you might ask, what does this have to do with kids? What does this have to do with adolescence? And that's what's coming next. So, your article that you read today, one of the two you read today, asked this question about blameworthiness in response to adolescent offenders. This article was interested in whether adolescent offenders might be less blameworthy, less culpable for their crimes because of their adolescence, because of their immaturity, because they're kids, right? So the question here is basically whether there is something about adolescent development and the processes that are relevant to adolescent development that change the conditions and circumstances of a crime, that reduce the blameworthiness, that reduce adolescents' culpability for their actions and for a crime. So basically, does being a kid make you less blameworthy for your crime? And if so, why? Why would being a kid make you have less culpability for your actions? So we'll look into this. First thing to clarify before we look into this is a difference here between excuse and mitigation. So in terms of excuse, if a crime is excused, that means that there is no responsibility for the crime and no punishment, no any kind of repercussion for the crime. That is if it is excused. However, if there is a mitigation or if there are mitigating circumstances, that means that the crime has some type of punishment, but the punishment is along a continuum of possible punishments in strictness, in that offenders would fall along a continuum then of responsibility, of culpability for their actions, and therefore they would also experience a continuum of punishment. If they are less culpable, if they are less responsible for their actions, then they have a lower punishment, one that's not as strict. So mitigating factors are ones that reduce culpability for one's actions. And what this article kind of argues is whether immaturity, being a kid, is a mitigating factor, is one that reduces the punishment you should get compared to an adult. So if an adult were to do a crime and a kid were to do the same thing, does that kid get kind of a little bit of a pass because they're a kid, because they're less mature? Does that make it so that they are punished less for the same crime? So that's what we're talking about, mitigating circumstances. So what are some mitigating circumstances? What are some mitigating factors for kids? Basically, we're going to be talking about four different factors that might contribute to youth being bad at decision making and having less culpability for their actions. So these 4 factors are susceptibility to peer influence, lack of a future orientation, lowered perception of risks, as well as being impulsivity. So they're kind of a bit self-explanatory, but I'll go through them one by one just to give you a general idea. So let's start with susceptibility to peer influence. So basically, this one right here is that kids are really vulnerable or are really affected by, in many ways, their social network, their social, the social pressures that exist around them, their friends. They experience peer pressure. Their friends tell them to do things, and they want to do those things because their friends tell them that. So there's been some research that has found that kids are really vulnerable to peer influences, and that their vulnerability to peer influences kind of increases between kind of childhood and early adolescence and peaks around age 14. So around age 14, research has found that kids have kind of very, you could think of it as like a weakness to peer influence, and that as they get older, moving from age 14 onwards, they have a resistance to damage by peer influence. But what people have found is that through both indirect and direct types of pressures, that kids are influenced to do different things. And this changes over time. It's particularly strong when you're a bit younger, when you're around, let's say, 14. But then the effect of peers and the kind of weight of peer influence decreases as we move into the high school years. So second, future orientation. Kids are less future oriented. Compared to adults, adults typically, when making a decision, consider long time frames, consider the future and the result of the future result of an action much more than an adolescent does. So adults typically will consider longer time frames than adolescents. And adolescents tend to discount the future much more than adults do. Instead, adolescents will tend to view or tend to consider short-term consequences or short-term gains when making a decision. So whether they should do something or not do something, adolescents will typically decide to do something based on the short term, what do they get in the short term, rather than on the long-term consequences. I'm gonna kind of make it real here for a second. I've been seeing a lot of news about college students going out on spring break, and interviews of them basically saying, yeah, we know about the coronavirus, we know that it's going like around, but we just want to have fun. We're here to party. We paid a lot of money. We're going to lose that money if we don't go to our spring break trip. We planned this trip for a long time, and if I get the coronavirus, I get the coronavirus, and that's going to be fine. So these types of statements, you could clearly see the lack of future orientation. It was focused on mainly the short term, right? Focused on, I'm going to lose money, and I'm not going to have fun, and I want to have fun. That is the short-term gains. And the long-term consequences of, I might get the coronavirus, I might pass this on to other people, that wasn't really considered much or weighted as much in their decisions. So, God, all of these are going to probably apply to that. The third one is adolescents are typically more willing to take risks. So, overall, adults might be more considerate of the consequences or risks that will result from an action, whereas adolescents are more likely to view the rewards and ignore the risks, or kind of weigh more on what they will gain rather than what they might lose from something. So, for example, in a gambling study, I think the article talked a bit about this gambling study, where they found that adolescents, when engaging in gambling, were much more focused on what they could potentially gain from risking and taking a gamble, like how much money they could get, rather than focusing on how much money they could possibly lose when gambling. And the final one we'll talk about here is impulsivity. So basically, adolescents, again, are more impulsive. And there's research that suggests or has found that impulsivity really increases between this time period of middle adolescence to early adulthood. And that in general, adolescents are more impulsive, and they're more prone to extreme mood swings, that they're more prone to shifting moods between high and low, and that adolescents, kind of building into this, are more likely to think of themselves as invincible. They don't see any bad thing as really something that could happen to them. And they see that as something that has a very low chance of happening to them. That it hasn't happened yet, it hasn't happened before, and it's probably not going to happen in the future. Again, you can probably see that in the example I gave, the perceived invulnerability. I'm not going to get the coronavirus. I'm not going to get it. I mean, it wouldn't happen to me. I'm not someone that would happen to. Again, that perceived invulnerability. So those are the 4 factors. Aside from these being found in research, these kind of more psychological measures, or more kind of behavioral measures, or behavioral outcomes, there's also been some research that looks at the neurobiological data, in particular looking at brain development over time, and which parts of the brain mature at which points in our life. And what they found overall is that the frontal lobe is one of the last regions of the brain to reach maturation, to fully mature as we grow older. And when we're adolescents, when people are still relatively young-ish, up to their 20s, up to roughly the early 20s, that frontal lobe region of your brain is still developing, is still not completely mature. And if you don't know, the frontal lobe is responsible for a variety of different things. Our attention, our working memory, our short-term memory, our judgment, as well as impulse control and decision-making. So the frontal lobe really... So the idea here is basically that adolescents might be more impulsive, might have a harder time making long-term types of judgment or long-term types of decision-making because of a lack of maturity in the frontal lobe. And looking at... So in this graph here, it basically shows maturation of the brain over time. I know it's a little hard to see, but basically on the top you have 5 years, and then at the bottom you have 10 years old. And if it is more of a red color, then it's less mature. And if it's more of a blue or purple color, it's more mature. And I just realized that this is probably a terrible graph for someone who's colorblind or has gradients of colorblindness, so fuck. I'm sorry. I will probably adjust this in a future lecture. But for those that can't perceive these colors, I apologize. But what you could see here is basically how the different regions of the brain mature over time. And as you might be able to notice, one of the final places to really reach for full maturation is that frontal lobe region of the brain. So that even into your 20s, there are pieces or there are areas that your frontal lobe is still kind of maturing in various ways. So takeaway message here, probably emphasize this multiple times, but it's basically kids are bad at making decisions, right? And tying it back to culpability, right? That these data, these findings suggest that juveniles might have a diminished decision-making capacity compared to adults. That kids are worse at making decisions compared to adults. And one reason this could be is psychosocial, and another reason this could be is biological. So that there are differences in psychosocial capacities between juveniles and adults. Juveniles are are more impulsive, for example, compared to adults, as well as they are fundamentally biologically different from adults, that parts of their brain are still developing, are still maturing. And that in particular, these things are relevant to people who are 15 years old and younger. So remember how I mentioned 14 was when that peak hit for one of those points that we discussed? And the rest of the data seem to suggest this, in that 15 years of age seems to be a shifting point where some people begin to act or think more like adults. Now, I don't know the cross-cultural validity of these findings, whether this is something that generalizes to other cultures, but I believe, at least for the US and for parts of Europe where this research was being conducted, that it seemed like children who are 15 years old or younger were at the peak of psychosocial immaturity, and potentially might be less culpable for their actions for any crimes that they might commit. So let's take this. I want you to take this framework and I want you to apply it to the next things I'm going to talk about. And basically, what we're going to apply it to are Miranda rights. So we're going to be talking about one decision that adolescents might make, which is to waive or to not waive their Miranda rights. For those that don't know, I'm going to give you a brief primer. So in the US, Miranda rights are basically these rights or procedural protections that you have when you are detained by the police to undergo some kind of questioning, to undergo some kind of interrogation. And they're required to inform you of these rights. Now, there's not a set script. Each state slightly varies in how they read out their Miranda rights and may give you a little bit more or a little bit less information. But in general, what people communicate when they give you your Miranda rights are, you have a right to remain silent. Anything you can say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided to you. Do you understand the rights I have read to you? With these rights in mind, do you wish to speak anything to me? Those last ones sometimes get skipped or aren't added at all, but typically they'll inform you about your rights, and then, do you understand it? Do you have any questions about it? So we'll talk about adolescents and whether they should be able to waive their Miranda rights or not. Because if adolescents are detained by the police, they have the ability to waive their Miranda rights. And it could be a question here of whether they should be able to. So, brief history of Miranda. Basically, this was a set of procedural rights established in the case of Miranda v. Arizona in 1966. And it was a decision that was relatively contentious. It was a 5-4 decision, so roughly 5-4, 5 people for and 4 people against. But a majority of the court concluded that there was a need for procedural safeguards when people interacted with the law and were detained for questioning. In particular, they say the Fifth Amendment requires that law enforcement officials advise suspects of their right to remain silent and to obtain an attorney during interrogations while in police custody. So this was set up by the court as a safeguard for people who are detained by police for interrogations. And knowing what you know about juveniles, right, knowing what you know now about adolescents, the question we might ask is, do adolescents have the capacity, the mental capacity, to fully understand and to fully follow their Miranda rights, should they wish? So, I want you to take a guess. How many people, how many juveniles, on average, do you believe waive their Miranda rights? So, pause here, pause the video if you'd like, and give me a number, a percentage, 1 to 100%. How many juveniles do you think waive their Miranda rights when they are taken into police custody? Give you a second. Okay, the answer is 90%. Looking at data from the American Bar Association from 2016, it was found that roughly 90% of juveniles that are taken into police custody decide to waive their Miranda rights at some point during that interrogation. And I will say there is variability in this number, that some studies can put it as high as 90%, though there is some wiggle room around that. And it's still not completely clear why juveniles waive their Miranda rights, though I bet you can take a few guesses. So let's talk about, as we're thinking about this question, should juveniles be able to waive their Miranda rights? Let's talk about what happens in a police interrogation. And two quick notes I want to talk in regards to this. Relates to deception and interrogation. First of which is that you can waive your Miranda rights explicitly or implicitly. You can tell the police, for example, that I don't need an attorney when they ask you if you'd like an attorney or not. And you can explicitly tell them, like, I don't need my Miranda rights to an attorney. I will waive that. You can explicitly tell them that. Or you can implicitly waive them as well. So, for example, you have the right to remain silent. If you just start talking, even though, let's say you said, I am exercising my right to remain silent, they can still ask you questions. And if at any point you just start answering their questions, you have waived your right to remain silent because you've started talking. So unless there's really a clear invocation of your Miranda rights, police can assume that you are implicitly waiving your rights. If you're acting in a way, if you're behaving in a way that waives those rights. If you decide to talk, if you decide to answer your questions, or in other ways, they can continue to ask you questions, and you can continue giving them answers, despite you maybe saying at the very start of this, I am choosing to remain silent. Because that can change. So, sorry. The second example of this that I want to give came from another Supreme Court case where police can also kind of tricksily ask you some questions. So, coming out of this case, a police officer said he was largely silent during the 3-hour interrogation, but near the end, he answered yes when we asked if he prayed to God to forgive him for the shooting. So this would be an implicit waiver of your Miranda rights, where during this 3-hour-long interrogation, All you said was yes when they said, "Do you pray to God to forgive you for the shooting?" And they take that as basically as a confession. You just said that you did the shooting. You said you prayed to God to get his forgiveness for the shooting. Which is kind of like the police way of saying a stupid person says what? Or a guilty person says what? So you can waive your rights implicitly or explicitly. Secondly, police can tell you your rights, but they're allowed to convince you to waive them. So during the interrogation process, they can convince you to not need those rights. They might say, "What do you need an attorney for? Why don't you just talk to me now? It's going to be easier if you talk to me now. If you talk to me, we're going to go easier on you. It's going to look better for you if you talk to us." They might say things to help to get you to convince you to waive your rights. So there's a lot we can talk about kind of regarding the police interrogation process. There's a whole bunch of research on the Reed interrogation technique, which is a technique that a lot of officers use and is taught kind of as the gold standard. We can talk about just the basic facts of how intimidating it is. You are being arrested, you are being taken into custody, maybe you're getting cuffed right now, and they're reading you your rights, and you're expected to be listening, you're expected to be understanding, and you're expected to clearly and coherently and with sound body and mind consent to them or waive them. And during a time when the fucking police are arresting you, that might not be within your ability to do, because imagine a kid getting arrested, right? They could be freaking out, they're not thinking straight. That's a side note, because we don't got time to talk about that, and you can look on that on your own. So, back to this question. Should they be able to waive their rights or not? There is one study, not quite answering this question, but looking at juveniles' understanding of Miranda rights. Looking at a basic level. Do you understand the rights that you have been told, yes or no? And basically what this scholar looked at was they compared adults and juveniles on their understanding of a Miranda rights kind of comprehension test. So they tested their comprehension of Miranda rights in various ways. And what they found was that only 20.9% of juveniles showed a decent or relatively good understanding of the Miranda rights, compared to 42.3% of adults. Both of them kind of on the low side, still both of them less than 50%, which is kind of crazy to think that overall less than 50% of people understand Miranda rights. But even more so for juveniles. Only 20.9% of juveniles in this study were shown to have a really good understanding of what Miranda rights really meant. What does it mean to interrogate? What does it mean to consult an attorney? These words, really difficult maybe for someone to understand. And there's been research which suggests the Miranda rights as they are read to people during, taking them into custody require you to have at least an 8th grade reading level to really understand them. And not everyone has that type of reading comprehension to be able to fully understand the types of words and the types of things being said when you're read your Miranda rights. And tying this back to age, this was in particular, again, shown around age 15, in that your understanding of Miranda rights was significantly associated with age, unsurprisingly, and that youth who were above the age of 15 were trending towards adults in their understanding, meaning that youth who were 15 years or older than 15 years old were more like adults or were becoming more like adults in their understanding of Miranda rights. So, I'm not going to answer here because this was technically going to be a class discussion, and I wanted you guys to answer this question. But think about this. Think about, should juveniles be able to waive their Miranda rights? Yes or no, or some other answer outside of yes or no, and why? You can think of it from the police perspective, you can think of it from the juvenile's perspective, from the state's perspective, from a parent, from any perspective that you can think of. And talk through yourself, should juveniles be allowed to waive their Miranda rights? Okay, so we're going to move into the last topic of today, of this week, really, which is the best interests of the child. So this is a framework that I want to introduce you all to begin to understand the rights of youth, the rights of the people you might be working with, and how they are viewed within the law. So typically this best interest of the child consideration takes into account three different perspectives here: parents, children, and the state. And this is basically a triangle of people who have a weight in deciding on what happens to someone. So who should determine what's in the best interest of the child? Should it be the parents? Should it be the state? Or should it be the child themselves? So this last piece, we will think about three different perspectives on who should determine what's in a child's best interest. We'll talk about the family libertarianism perspective, the state interventionism perspective, and the children's rights perspective. And as you can imagine, each of these three corresponds to a point in that triangle. Family is parents should decide, state is state should decide, and children's rights are children should decide. So let's start with family. Oh, this is weirdly animated. Gotta fix that. Let's start with family libertarianism. This perspective basically holds that families have a natural right to raise their kids. And it's built on this idea that society should be and is organized around the family unit. That society is built around family. And that family should be autonomous from government intervention unless there are extreme circumstances, such as child abuse or neglect. But outside of these, that family libertarianism holds that parents should make a decision for the family. That families have a natural right, and when they talk about families here, typically they're talking about parents, that parents have a natural right to raise their kids however the fuck they want. Sorry, I'm swearing too much recently. Families have a natural right to raise their kids however they wish, and the state should not be able to intervene with that unless there are extreme circumstances. This perspective holds an assumption that parents should make decisions for the kid because they're the one that knows the best. They're the ones that know what is in the best interest of the child because they are responsible for raising the family, and they're the ones who have known the kids the most, and they're the ones that can tell you what is going to be in their kids' best interest. It also assumes that children lack this ability, that children lack the capacity to make informed decisions. And maybe they do. Decide for yourself. Think back on some of the things that we've discussed and whether that weighs here. But there's an assumption that children lack the capacity to make an informed decision, and that families are in the best position because parents are mature, experienced, and they're the ones who, as, like real adults, should be the ones that make the decisions for the kids. Because they're the adults and the kids are the kids. So let's move on. State interventionism. So this perspective is, again, about the state. And it holds that governments should protect those who cannot protect themselves. So this is based on this doctrine, or this idea of parens patriae. And broadly, this legal kind of concept gives discretion to the state to intervene or act as a temporary guardian for vulnerable individuals. That the states have a right to protect those who cannot protect themselves. That is parens patriae in a nutshell. And when need be, states can step in and supersede the rights of parents or children and act as a temporary guardian to act in the best interest of the child. So this perspective holds that governments should decide what is in the best interest of the child sometimes. That governments can infringe on the rights of parents in cases of abuse, in cases of neglect, in cases when they need to exercise parens patriae, when they need to protect vulnerable individuals, and in particular here, children. Or this can also apply to elderly, those who are incapacitated in some way or incarcerated, but the state can infringe on the rights of others when it is determined they need to protect vulnerable people. Last perspective, children's rights. This, as you can imagine, is the final point of our triangle, and the one that holds children should have some of the same rights as adults, and should have some ability to decide what is in their best interest. So this kind of evolved out of a case of, well, no, you don't need to go through the history. There's like this whole history, kitty libbers and like savers and blah, blah, blah. But the gist of this is basically that children have some of the same rights as adults. They have these rights to nurturance, the rights to receive an education, to receive medical treatment, the rights to make autonomous decisions. That even though children might be immature in various ways, that children might be the ones to best determine what is in their interest. What is in the best interest of yourself? I mean, who might be more fit to say that than the person in question, is basically what this perspective holds. So, children have some rights and can make some decisions. So these are some considerations. This triangle is basically how some of the ways we treat youth are determined. What is in the best interest of a youth might balance what does the parent decide, what does the child decide, what does the state decide. So there is no necessarily right or wrong. It's not like one of these pieces of the triangle, one of these corners is the correct one. Potentially all of them are correct, or potentially none of them are. I'm, again, going to leave it up to you. I give you some idea, and I want you to take it and use it, think about it, apply it, come to your own conclusion. And use it, think about it, when you are working in your future occupation. Okay, so that's basically it for today. I'm going to run through some closing statements, and I also want to acknowledge before these closing statements end that we are only having one lecture, I'm doing air quotes, you can't see this, a week, lecture, and I'm going to try to keep it under 60 minutes, or roughly 60 minutes. Normally we have 80 minutes per class session. 2 class sessions a week means we have 160 minutes roughly to work with. So I'm cutting a lot of things. I'm cutting a lot of material. And this is to give you all more time, right? Because I can't expect you to pay attention to a crazy long 160 minutes or however many minutes this would be video if we did it for 2 class sessions. So in the terms of cutting things down, that's what's happening. this ends our first lecture. So for next time, well, I should say for this week, make sure you turn in your rough drafts, and also make sure you participate in the discussion forum. It's small group stuff. You should be able to see the discussion, and the discussion should be filled with just your group members from your group project. I don't know 100% for sure. This is my first time doing it, so if things mess up with it, I apologize, but that is the intention. It'll be a discussion between your small group members. So that's what you got for this week, is you gotta do the discussion, and you gotta turn in your rough drafts. For next week, we are watching a documentary. Luckily, I have access to this documentary such that I can post it online for you. So I'll be posting it on Canvas. Instead of doing a lecture, you will be watching the documentary. So I will post that on Canvas as soon as I work out all the stuff I need to work out for this week. And I want you to watch it and complete the discussion on it. I will post that discussion also this week, as well as turn in your first individual progress report. So these are the things you have due for this week and next week. I hope you're well, and I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I look forward to seeing what you write, seeing your discussions, seeing your project rough drafts and your ideas come together, and I miss you guys, and I hope you have a great week. So, yeah. End of transmission.